Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. We're going to have to excuse me in this episode. My baby son has gotten me sick again. And so I'm struggling with a bit of a cold or something. Flu, COVID, whooping cough, who knows?
A nice melange. The good news is he sounds worse than he looks. He looks handsome as ever.
Yeah. Or maybe the sound has sort of descended to my normal, sort of troglodytic appearance. But at any rate, apologies for that. You'll just have to bear with me, and I'll try to edit out as many of my hacking coughs as I can. But anyway, yeah. So that out of the way, we're pleased to welcome Eoin Higgins. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. To the podcast, author of a new book called Owned: How Tech Billionaires on the Right Bought the Loudest Voices on the Left. Available now in bookstores. Is there going to be an audiobook version, by the way?
There is an audiobook version, yeah. It's read by Ramsey Youssef, I think is the guy's name. He was great. Yeah, that's how my wife is reading it right now, actually.
Oh, cool.
It's audiobook, yeah.
Nice. So that's available as well. The book, it's kind of funny, the book centers around two journalists, Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, and I happen to have made extensive YouTube videos about both of those guys. That covers a lot of the same ground as your book.
If you'll remember, Glenn Greenwald came to attack us when we had Mehdi Hassan on, but then had to awkwardly pretend he didn't actually listen to it because that was beneath him. So he had this weird thing where he was attacking what we were saying, but pretending not to have actually listened.
Yeah. Weird dude.
Friend of the show then.
Yeah.
Real friend of the pod.
Yeah. And so like you, Owen, I actually, Greenwald was the first blogger that I ever read back in about 2005 on his blog, Unclaimed Territory, and I started getting into, liberal, politics, was kind of radical politics as I understood it in those days. And he was one of the people that wasn't, like the New York Times self-lobotomized politics desk. Yeah. And so, maybe you can start by just giving us a picture of these guys, and how they came to be the fixtures on kind of the broad progressive left, circa, say 2008 to, 2013 or something like that.
Yeah. So I think, I think I'm a little bit older than you. So my encounter with Glenn came when it was around the same time, 2005, 2006. I had already kind of had the rude awakening that the rest of the country just did not share the way that I looked at the world, with like the wars on Afghanistan and on Iraq, and like the so-called war on terror. And like I was feeling pretty demoralized and, the life stuff. And I came across this stuff when I was going back to school in around 2005, 2006. And then I went back to school in 2007. And the thing I really liked about him was that he wasn't like a liberal. I kind of thought of him as someone who was on the left at the time, but primarily what his politics were primarily about, was like civil libertarian attacks on what the Bush administration was doing. And he really made a career for himself doing that. Unclaimed Territory led to Salon, led to The Guardian. Guardian led to the Edward Snowden reporting when he was, probably the key reporter in exposing the scope of NSA spying. And Taibbi at the same time, maybe a little bit later, reinvented himself as a lefty kind of econ explainer. Where he was kind of breaking down the financial crisis in a way that people could understand that was like entertaining to read. And, circa 2007, 2008, that was really essential, I think, for a lot of young people and a lot of people who were kind of looking. I mean, like you were saying, a lot of the mainstream political discourse at the time, much like now, was kind of constrained by this necessity, I think, on the part of, or this felt necessity on the part of editors to kind of force a moderation or a centrism or kind of a both sides approach to, especially to what the Bush administration was doing. And that definitely made, I mean, it sounds like it made you feel this way. It certainly made me feel this way, kind of like adrift and alone and like not really knowing like where like your political home was in a lot of ways. And so this like liberal blogosphere that these guys came out of, even though Taibbi was on Rolling Stone, but he was in conversation with all of these guys. This lefty online writing movement that came out of the Bush years really propelled Greenwald's career, and I would argue Taibbi's career as well, to the point that, you know, by the mid 2010s, by the early 2010s, when they were objecting to the things that Obama was doing that were, you know, essentially like the same thing that Bush was doing during the war on terror, they had a lot of credibility to say that kind of stuff. They did lose some audience by doing this, but I think they gained some as well. So, but there was some credibility, like there was still like a left movement to be able to do that. And I think that was probably a good moment for them, because as time went on, as I argue in the book, and I think you guys would agree here, that like their politics became, instead of, you know, this kind of principled objection to these policies, right, or these ideas or these ideologies, their politics became anti-liberal, not necessarily at that time conservative, but anti-liberal. And that kind of became like the all-encompassing like obsession.
And under the Obama administration, that might have been a little different in the sense that it still seemed like maybe speaking truth to power, but then the shift with Trump and then the shift with going on Tucker and Fox News was like, okay, now you're not so much speaking truth to power, but like finding ways to boost your own brand in ways that have nothing to do with where the power is really at right now. Yeah, I mean, this is I think when things really changed, right? So I kind of trace it back, and again, like I want to be clear that I'm not speaking for them. This is just my interpretation of their actions and their writing and like what they said. And to an extent, like Glenn told me this when I was interviewing him for the book. So I think that that's a part of it. But there was a profound disappointment that people in the liberal blogosphere were not holding on to the same principles that they felt that especially Glenn felt that he was holding on to. You know, maybe this is an unfair standard to hold people to, but I think that it was nonetheless like the standard that he was holding people to. So for him, watching people like Rachel Maddow, to a lesser extent, Chris Hayes, I mean, to mention another person who he, you know, used to praise a lot, Charlie Pierce. I'm not sure if him and Joy Reid ever crossed paths at the time, but like they were in the same like milieu, right? They were in the same like blogosphere. A lot of the like Lawrence O'Donnell, he used to love Lawrence O'Donnell when Lawrence O'Donnell had him on MSNBC, right? So there is obviously like a feeling of like a lack of access and a loss of being part of this kind of network, this liberal network that happened as Obama's presidency stretched on, and MSNBC really kind of became, in a lot of ways, like the liberal Democratic mouthpiece in the media. If you're going to criticize Obama and it's not going to be coming from what's kind of like this establishment right, which is like what they want. They want the establishment right and the establishment left to be arguing with each other. This isn't like some like conspiracy here. This is just like the way that these media, like they have certain parameters. Like that's how they want the argument to happen. They don't want Glenn Greenwald to come on there and make this argument from what would have then been the left, I think. And so Glenn certainly started to kind of seek out these principled conservatives. And then I think that when Trump won in 2016, the Democratic reaction to this was to basically say Russia did it, as opposed to have any like real introspection at the party leadership, and especially like the way that the mainstream media, MSNBC and CNN especially, reacted to this is like they started to embrace this, and then they found that the more outlandish stuff that they said, the more their ratings went up. And it was just kind of like it was the incentives were very clear. And Matt and Glenn both objected to this and earned, I think, the ire of liberals, both like in the media and kind of like the general quote unquote resistance, whether it's, like
a big name or just like somebody on Twitter, like whatever. Like I think that a lot of people who were liberals were really angry about this, and they were. I mean, if to remember back to that moment, I mean, people were in shock that this had happened, and things got really bad really fast. Now it seems slow in comparison to like the last 3 weeks, but at the time, you know, it was very fast. And I think that people, and I'm being much more generous now in hindsight, right, than I was at the time, but I think that like people were just really like looking for something that would explain what had just happened. And I feel like there were a lot of elements of the media that were taking advantage of that. But the way to combat that wasn't to just like kind of call them all stupid, which is kind of what Greenwald and Taibbi were doing at the time. But they just kind of like reverse polarize themselves into this position of like anti-liberalism and anti-democratic party, which is fine. But like, because of this, though, because of this, like, this is the reason, like, it's because this is how they're attacking Trump. And I think if you do that for long enough and you do that in an intense enough way, you end up becoming kind of de facto pro-Trump. And that, to me, is kind of like where we get to when it's like, you know, 2018 and Tucker Carlson is starting to have Glenn on, and Glenn's like embracing that because MSNBC isn't having him on anymore. Then, you know, by the time that 2020 rolls around, he's trying to like launder this like Hunter Biden laptop story that, you know, at the time, no one knows like what's true about this. It seems like total rat fucking, and but he's like insisting on that he leaves The Intercept. Maybe I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I'm just trying to like track like that evolution of ideology basically through like that 10 years.
It seems to me that Glenn and Matt made basically the inverse mistake of the kind of more hysterical Madhouse segments, or that Jonathan Chait cover story you mentioned that said, you know, Trump is a Russian plant. You know, because like the facts of the matter were that Russia did hack the DNC and John Podesta, and they did dribble out the emails very carefully over the entire election. And it probably did influence things in a very boring way. It wasn't like cloak and dagger stuff. It was just like putting out a whole bunch of stuff that the New York Times and whatnot couldn't help but cover, you know, relentlessly. And it made it this vague aura of scandal, you know, just surround Hillary Clinton. It was word clouds of like what was the most important issue, what appeared in media coverage the most. And Hillary was emails. It was like, what does even that mean? But it didn't even matter. It just became this huge scandal. And the New York Times especially wrote 50 billion stories about it. And, you know, you know, Glenn, he spent all these, you know, just jumping on every time somebody exaggerated something or they got something wrong. And it didn't turn out to be true. Like a Republican Senate committee, it came out with the, you know, Russia did it. The Trump campaign was involved with Paul Manafort, and, you know, Trump's welcomed it to happen. And meanwhile, you know, Glenn lost his, like, you know, you talk about losing your principles for like to get ratings. But like the thing that sort of lost, I think that it was almost most important of all, and that a lot of people still don't know, is that Trump was horrible on all the same stuff that George W. Bush was horrible on. Surveillance. He radically escalated the drone war. Iraq and Syria were just pummeled during his first term. And he put a torturer, one of the people involved in Bush's torture regime, in charge of the CIA. And Glenn basically didn't talk about any of that stuff. And so, yeah, I think that kind of leads, you know, like the meat of your book, you know, you're talking about like sort of the incentive structure and how the big tech billionaires were involved in this. And I think that's the next thing I'd want to talk about is like how the incentives shift and how the incentives aren't always, you know, it's like you can talk about, Noam Chomsky manufacturing consent and how media has to appease advertisers and so on. But then you can also have just a straight up ideological right wing billionaire who just pays people tons of money to say right wing things. So talk about that, Peter Thiel and Marc Andreessen, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that just to address the first thing that you were saying there, because I think that's, you know, a good and interesting point, that I can't like look back on what I wrote back then and reasonably like criticize Glenn and Matt for taking like liberals and Democrats to task for this stuff, because I did a lot. But I think you're right that like you can't just do that, right? You have to like address like who's in power as well. The reason to examine how the nominal opposition party is fighting against who's in power is because you want them to fight against who's in power, because that's what because criticizing power and taking on power is like what journalism is supposed to be. And you're completely right. Like Trump did all of this stuff. And I'm sure Glenn, if he's listening, would be able to go back and cite any number of like individual tweets here and there where he like criticized Trump like once in a while. And sure, like that's like, okay, yeah. But you have to like look at the breadth and the weight of it and how much he did it. And honestly, like he just didn't do it that often. He just didn't find criticizing Trump that interesting. And he said on a number of occasions, you know, the rest of the media is doing this. Nobody's taking on Russiagate. So that's what I'm going to do. And I just don't think that that's I think that's just like totally getting lost in like Twitter discourse brain. Like, who cares? Like at a certain point, like, look, you want to write like one article a week, like shitting on like the Democrats or like liberal people on Twitter for like their hyper obsession over Russia. Like that's fine. Okay. But like, you know, you have the rest of the week. Like, you know, there's other stuff that's going on that's like more important in my view, you know, like
that's a great point. What I really like about what you pointed out there is the difference between pointing out how ineffectual the Democrats and liberals are at fighting the real enemy and how they enable the enemy, right? Like how liberalism can enable fascism, how the Democrats can enable the Republicans. But then like transitioning from that to making the liberals and Democrats the real enemy, or at least like seeming like that's what you're doing. That's what people would take from like all the time and energy you spend is that, oh, that's actually the enemy. And that feeds right into when we get to like Elon Musk and the woke virus and all of this stuff, it like feeds in to the Rogan media culture.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely does. And, you know, when I interviewed him for the book, Adam Johnson, who, you know, was somebody who I think took a similar approach to this stuff than I did, was like, Russiagate just broke a lot of people's brains. To go to the incentive structure, I mean, so at the same time, there's kind of this parallel media story going on, which is, and I wrote about this first, and I keep thinking of this article that I wrote back in 2021, because I think it basically kind of forms like the thesis of the book, which is that tech billionaires, you know, I use Marc Andreessen in this article as the prime example of like a way to examine it. But, you know, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, like all these guys were getting really sick of the way that they were being covered in media. It wasn't sycophantic enough. You know, they were getting criticized. Their businesses were being like looked at, scrutinized, right? And they felt like they had kind of a deal, I think, where tech journalists would like kind of come to their events and like check out their products, and in exchange would give them good coverage, and nobody would really look at what they were doing under the hood or any of that stuff. And, you know, maybe occasionally, like, you know, there might be like a story about like Facebook, you know, accidentally starts a pogrom in Malaysia or something like that. But you just kind of like, you know, brush that under the rug, right? But, you know, but other than things that couldn't be avoided to cover, like, you know, like they kind of expected like positive press. And, you know, I trace it back to Valleywag, which was the Gawker Media Silicon Valley gossip blog. But I think that it even goes like maybe earlier than that, like the .com bubble. They didn't like that. Andreessen is on record really not liking, or like he's on record, but there's reporting from the 90s that he felt like he wasn't being taken seriously enough. He got a lot of crap for this cover that he did for Time magazine, where he was like barefoot and like people like didn't, you know, people like made fun of him. And this is in the 90s, and he got really upset about that apparently. So he like they had all felt that they weren't getting taken seriously enough for a long time. They had all felt kind of upset with like the way that as they saw elite opinion. You know, I can't remember if this is in the book or not, but I think it is. I was talking to somebody who was in Silicon Valley at the same time, like a former executive, and he anonymously, and he said that when MySpace came out, they had no idea it was coming, because who would give a shit about like these dumb LA party people? That's how they thought they saw MySpace, because they thought of themselves like these elite San Francisco people, like that this was the only place that like tech was going to come from, right? And I think that that's really interesting because it's kind of like, it sets up like that nerd jock dichotomy kind of, where they're like, well, we're like the good guys here. We're the serious ones. Like anyone who is like taking the other side, like, you know, like they're not serious. They don't matter. So that's a kind of a really long way of coming all the way back around to saying, like, by the mid-Trump administration, these guys were really sick of media. They were sick of liberals too, because Democrats, in addition to looking at Russia, also looked at social media as the reason that they had lost the election. And they held hearings, and they were very aggressive about the role of social media in the election, but which I don't really think there's a very strong case to be made to, like, you know, that social media can be like held to account. It's like, you know, free speech. But at the same time, I think it's great to put these guys, you know, to subpoena them and make them sweat, because I always want to find out like what's going on under the hood there. Right. So they were very irritated about that. NSA spying scandal had only been like, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. They had a lot of bad press from that. And so my theory is, and you know, this is backed up by what they've said and what, you know, people around them have said, is that what they wanted was a more pliant and sycophantic press. And if they weren't going to be able to get that from the mainstream media, they wanted to do the move fast and break things thing for overall media and just decentralize it completely and weaken all the institutions that they possibly could, and just kind of like let whatever, you know, survive. And I think if you look at their investments in like Substack and Rumble and, you know, Callin, Clubhouse, like all this stuff, you know, I actually don't know Parler had any of their investments in it, but, you know, like, but all of these like little right-wing sites that popped up, like that were like new platforms that had all of this money, that were like giving people money to come over. Like, this was a huge incentive structure for independent journalists and for people with big names to leave the institutions that they were in and come to these like new decentralized media apparatuses. And it largely worked, I think. You know, Glenn and Matt were not poached, as far as I can tell. I'm almost positive that they weren't poached. They just went over there because they knew that they could make more money. And you know, we can talk about the incentive structures for them specifically in like, you know, a little bit later, but just right now, I just want to say, like, the incentive structure though, for people like me, like I say in the book, like Colin gave me money to do a podcast, you know, like the giving people money to come over to these platforms has, I think, worked as far as this decentralization and weakening of institutions. You know, Matt Iglesias, who I don't have a very high opinion of like what he thinks and what he says, but it's undeniable that he was a big name at Vox, and he did a lot of writing at Vox, and he added to Vox's, I guess, prestige, or just like their name being a big name in media. And Substack gave him a couple $100,000 to come over to Substack, and now he makes upwards of $500,000 on the platform, right? But not having him at Vox is damaging for Vox. You know, same with Taibbi when he, you know, and again, wasn't given money to do it, but when he left Rolling Stone, like that weakened Rolling Stone. When Glenn left The Intercept, that weakened The Intercept. Again, you don't have to have a high opinion of what they were doing at these outlets. I'm just talking about like what it does to the outlet, how it damages the outlet itself. You know, I would say like Ken Klippenstein is another example of this, right? Him leaving The Intercept was damaging to The Intercept as well. Where did he go? He went to Substack. He wasn't poached either. He made the decision to leave for his own decision, for his own reason. You know, Barry Weiss left the New York Times. That's a little bit of a different situation, because I don't think that she's was particularly important for that opinion page, but she's managed to create something that now is like a competitor to that, or maybe more of a competitor to The Atlantic, I guess. So it's just this kind of, I'm using Substack here as the example, right? But all of these things are doing that. They're taking people and they're pulling them over to here, and it's this kind of decentralization of media and a weakening of institutions. And again, this isn't a defense of mainstream media. This isn't a defense of institutional media. I'm just trying to like point out like what's happening here.
Yeah, an important part of the Thiel story that you go over in your book is how he bankrupted Gawker. Valleywag was part of Gawker Media. It only existed for a few years, but it really, because they had a very just buccaneering, take no prisoners tabloid style, and they would just dig up all the most dirty gossip and whatever that they could find. And the way Thiel killed them is with pretextual lawsuits. He secretly spent millions of dollars under cover of darkness to fund endless pretextual lawsuits till he found one that got before a favorable judge and bankrupted the company. That was the one with Hulk Hogan. People do argue that Gawker didn't acquit itself that well in the trial, but on the other hand, it would have got him eventually, you could just keep suing people till they run out of insurance money. And, Glenn got in addition to his Substack money, he got, according to the Washington Post, a 6-figure contract from Rumble, which Thiel is a big investor in. That's a YouTube competitor. If you haven't seen it, it's not very successful, but these guys don't care if it loses money. And I think, an interesting part of this, the way that so many of these are going to sort of subscriber monetization strategies, is that exposes you to market forces in a much more direct way than the kind of indirect manufacturing consent Noam Chomsky mechanism that he talks about in his book, through advertising and so on and so forth. Like I've seen it myself with the Patreon subscriptions for this podcast, or, views on YouTube and stuff where you have to be very, very careful about the kind of audience you cultivate. Because there is a very large and a very willing to subscribe number of people on the right who will pay you to say conservative things. Both Peter Thiel with direct 6-figure checks and, this population of subscribers. And, also when Glenn was going on Tucker all the time, Tucker would plug his Substack and tell his millions of Fox News viewers to go and subscribe to Glenn. Well, now you have a capitalist business incentive to tell the people what they want to hear. And it's way, way more. It's not only much more direct, it's much more real time. You can open up the app at any point and see, okay, how good did this post do? How many subscriptions did I convert? How many did I lose this month? Am I treading water, or am I making, it can be a really powerful tool. And I want, I think, kind of as you get to in the book a little bit, that these tech guys kind of realize that on some level, that this is a sort of powerful engine of discipline that, you just look at the difference between Taibbi on Substack versus Taibbi and Rolling Stone, Greenwald and The Guardian versus Greenwald on Substack. They're just bellowing conservative guys now.
Which is especially pernicious given that their brand was built on being independent voices who would speak truth to power and go against the current and all that. To be co-opted by billionaires and have them then shift in these reactionary ways is really dangerous. The billionaires aren't dumb. They're grabbing people that people think are independent, right? That's part of the appeal of getting those guys. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, a couple things to address here. So I think I would start with Thiel, which is if you look at the timeline, it's hard to remember how fast all this happened, but Greenwald left The Intercept November 2020. He saw Thiel and JD Vance, a funding round led by them, invested in Rumble, the conservative YouTube alternative, in May of 2021. That's 6 months later. And then 3 months later, in August 2021, there's a 6-figure deal announced with Glenn and Tulsi Gabbard to come over to Rumble. And I think, a couple months after that, Glenn was like, under the terms of my deal, I have to basically shut down my Substack and move all of my writing over to Locals, which is the Dave Rubin founded blogging platform that he sold to Rumble, and then, was going to, and then, so then, that's the blogging platform that Glenn has to use. As far as the incentives kind of going from there, I mean, I don't think that you get offered that if you're not a conservative pundit, right? And I think that's one main incentive that you can see. I was asked, for an example of this, just pay to play thing by this guy named Andrew Keen, and that's kind of what I referenced. I said, well, Rumble just gave him money after the Peter Thiel investment. That's a pretty easy one, like right there. But it's kind of more than that though, because I think that the incentive structure that exists is a little more complicated than that. So not only is it that Glenn is doing Rumble for money, he's also doing paid appearances at the All In conference, which is David Sachs, Jason Kalinakis, and a couple of their buddies, their investor buddies in San Francisco. They have this conservative podcast. They had a conference. They had, Glenn has, I think, appeared on a couple of them, at least one with Matt Taibbi on that as well. And Balaji Srinivasan, his network state conference, Glenn appeared there. I talked to Glenn about that in our interview. He said that he was kind of just claimed kind of ignorance about what the whole thing was about. It was just like, oh, I just went there and just gave my normal speech. And it was just an excuse to, take a vacation, which, like let's take him on good faith. Sure. But like, you're not going to be offered that opportunity without already establishing yourself as an ally to the movement that they're trying to promote. So I think that whole network incentive has to be understood as well. And speaker fees and things like that are often the kind of unnoticed grift that is offered to people. They're often the way that powerful institutions on the left or the right can give money and funding to the people whose ideas they like. And this is an example of that. So those incentives definitely are there, as they were for Matt, like when he did the Twitter files, right? Like he was picked by Musk to do the Twitter files because David Sachs recommended him. David Sachs, an arch conservative host of All In, friend of Thiel's from Stanford days. Like they've known each other for a long time. He's been on the right. He's a member of the PayPal mafia. Andreessen actually is the one who suggested Barry Weiss. He's also the one who led a funding round for the Free Press, which valued it at kind of improbable $100 million, but that allowed them to raise $15 million. And, when Matt got access to the files from Musk, from all appearances, did exactly what he had been asked to do, as far as publishing on Twitter before publishing anywhere else, which, by the way, I don't think that that's out of line at all. If you're being given documents by somebody who's like the CEO of a company and they want you to put it on their platform first, I don't think that that's out of line or unreasonable. I do think it's a little unreasonable to dodge and avoid questions about how curated the documents were, and then just kind of pretend that you were just given unfettered access when you even address it at all. But anyway, that was in November 2022 or early December 2022. In December 2022, Matt did an interview with Jordan Ull and David Sirota for the Lever podcast. It was aired live on Colin. And in the conversation, Jordan confronted Matt with, a quote from a book called Hate Inc. that Matt wrote, and kind of just read his own words back to him, specifically this part where Matt talks about how the Department of Defense or CIA or whoever, they're not going to leak to someone and then tell them, hey, you have to write this the way that we want you to write this. It's understood that they're going to write this the way that you want them to write this. And if they don't, they're not going to get leaked to again. So he's just basically isn't this the same thing? And of course, Matt said, no, it's not the same thing at all, even though clearly it is exactly the same thing. But I think that kind of incentive structure that I was just describing with the speaking fees and being selected to go to Rumble and in the first place is basically the same thing here. They're not picking you because they know that they're picking you because they know they don't need to tell you this, that you're already going to do this. And so that's kind of the underlying implicit incentive structure here, and kind of I think what keeps these guys being I think, Ryan, what you kind of referred to as kind of, or maybe Lexus, that was you, the kind of run the mill conservative Republican pundits, right? Just you go to Glenn's. Well, I'll start with Matt because it's a little more simple. You go to his Twitter page and it's just rampant transphobia, anti-vax stuff, and then he's talking about Russiagate and the Twitter files. He's living in the past, or he's just blathering on with this culture war stuff. You go to Glenn's, it's a little more interesting because I think he's smarter. And so he's always trying to like think about like, hey, if I have to like pivot back, I want to be able to like look back at this and be like, say there's some plausible deniability here. Right. So, but it is basically the same thing. I mean, I think, what was it today? He was saying that, you know, he's really disappointed that they're going to go after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because that goes against like, the MAGA movement's stated goal of like helping Americans. And I'm just like, man, like, like, what are you talking about? Like, and as like an example of like why it is this way, he brought up like Josh Hawley co-sponsoring 2 go nowhere bills from with Bernie Sanders, like that, like completely meaningless like legislation that has no chance of even getting out of committee. And that like those 2 instances are enough to like make that point. So I think that it's not shame, but I think that Glenn probably feels like a little bit like, well, you know, I don't want to be like too obvious here, so I'm going to try and not be too obvious. Well, Glenn Matt just doesn't care anymore. He just doesn't care.
Right. Like at least Glenn stood up for the Palestinians. And although interestingly, that's something that like the Tucker Carlsons of the world and the Joe Rogans also do a little bit. And there's a kind of thing that I've noticed with like, whether it's Tucker or even Trump, that part of their appeal is that once in a while they'll say something that's like extremely obvious that everyone knows, but that establishment Republicans and Democrats won't admit. And that like solidifies them as like trust agents for their fans, right? And I think maybe like the obvious like destruction of Gaza and mass killing is one of those things that like people like Tucker's like, hey, I'm going to differentiate myself from a Ben Shapiro here by saying something really obvious. And it might be that Glenn really actually cares about Palestinians. I don't know. But it also could be that like cynically, it doesn't hurt him to say those things, right?
I think that as far as Tucker goes or Rogan, it's very easy for them. It was very easy for them to oppose what was going on in Gaza because a Democrat was in office while it was happening and enabling it and cheerleading it and enthusiastically backing it. So it's very easy to just, you know, take that position, and then Trump comes into office and there's a ceasefire. I mean, like this is, you know, like kind of writes itself like why this wouldn't be a problem for them, you know, ideologically, right? As far as Glenn goes, I would actually give him a little more grace on this just because he has been consistent on this issue for such a long time. But what I would say is that his criticism of people on the right over the silencing of protest and the general discourse around Palestine over the last like year and a half has focused on a kind of underlying truth for him, which is that if conservatives do this, they're no better than liberals. So it always becomes this kind of backhanded attack on the same people that he's attacked. It's always swiping at the left.
Right.
So I guess that I'm kind of 2 minds about that, which is that like, I think that it's the one place where he's acquitted himself relatively well, I think in the last like 4 or 5 years. And he has always been consistent on this, but, and I also should say like on his System Update show, like he has been going after Trump for his Gaza comments. This is certainly not universal, but I do think that it needs to be contextualized a little bit there, that he's still speaking to a conservative audience and he's still using this in somewhat of a partisan way. And so I think that is important to note. I don't really feel that I don't give Tucker Carlson like a good faith excuse ever. Like like there's nothing there. Like, I mean, you guys probably remember like the leak, the Bubba the Love Sponge radio show that he used to go on. Or whatever it was, where he was just like saying things about Arabs in Iraq and like just horrific
total
stuff.
white
I don't
supremacist
like
stuff.
Yeah. So I don't believe a word that I don't believe for a second that like he has somehow changed his views on that to the extent that he may hold any of this in any kind of real way. I think it would be the most anti-Semitic way possible. But I don't.
Whereas with Glenn, you see some integrity, but then you also document in your book places where, like, you know, with Taibbi, it's a little unclear if he was ever coherent ideologically or if he's really politically savvy or astute. But with Glenn, you have like statements protecting and defending trans rights, and then later on, like, diametrically opposed and being the one attacking trans people. So, like, maybe explain what you think goes on there. I don't know. I mean, is it possible he's just shifted his beliefs or something, or is that maybe a more cynical move?
I don't really know. I think of everything that Glenn's kind of shifted on, I think that might be the one that, like, just kind of depresses me the most, because he was, like, someone who was willing to defend people in marginalized communities who were under attack from primarily the right, but sometimes, like, elements of, like, liberalism. And I always thought that, like, back in the day, like, he had a really good way of, it's kind of funny because of what I was just talking about, but back in the day, a really good way of, like, tying liberals doing this back to conservatives and be like, well, what are you doing? Like, this is, like, this is what conservatives do. So maybe that's what, part of it is. I don't really know, like, how this change happened. He did explain it to me. This is in the book, that he felt that, and it's also, like, he did this interview with this like-minded podcaster called Katie Herzog, and said that, like, there was, like, a ladder of oppression that, and trans people get to jump to the front of it. And, like, gay, lesbian, bisexual people are kind of left behind. And, like, like, this kind of idea that there's only so many civil rights to go around. And, like, you have to, like, protect your slice of the pie, which is not, again, like, not really what this civil liberties guy used to say, but, does say it now. He did tell me that he is less impressed with Libs of TikTok, Kaya Raichik, now, that he feels that she has now gone too far, which is convenient for him to say, considering he used to say that he was the godfather of her account. I find that I don't really know what's going on. It's kind of like, maybe he just got more socially conservative as he got older. Maybe his brain just broke from social media. Maybe this is just the way he feels now. I mean, he got really mad at Chelsea Manning. I was going to say,
that's my theory, that when Chelsea Manning came after him on Twitter, he, like, vindictively leaked her DMs, in retaliation. And I think that maybe soured him. There's one thing about Glenn. He's incredibly self-righteous. Will never admit he's wrong about anything, with the very most rare of exceptions. And that raises one thing, actually, I wanted to mention real briefly. You kind of skip over it quickly in the book, but when in his early career, Glenn went to the mattresses defending this Nazi, like, terrorist, basically a Nazi cult leader who was closely associated with this guy, so the Nazi dude was named Hale, and his friend was named Ben Smith, I think, and he went on a shooting rampage and killed a bunch of minorities. And Glenn, before and after that, was basically torched his legal career trying to get, not just defend this guy, but to get him admitted to the Illinois State Bar. So they, not just to, like, keep him out of prison or something, or protecting his rights in court or whatever, but to get him admitted to the bar. And he went to the extent of illegally recording conversations with a witness, which had him censured by the court. And, as late as, like, 2005, he was still saying that Hale was wrongfully convicted. He was convicted. I think the FBI got him conspiring to murder a judge. And, he's in prison to this day. Hale is. And, that suggests to me possibly that also in his kind of flirtation with Ron Paul in around 2007, despite Ron Paul's, newsletter history of writing incredibly racist stuff or it being published under his name, and maybe a kind
Tom Credo.
Yeah. A kind of, sympathy for, like, right-wing extremists, like it's very strange, for someone to do that. By the way, funny story in there, this Hale fellow, he originally wanted to get Alan Dershowitz, but Dershowitz was too expensive for him. So Greenwald was sort of the budget Jewish attorney that he could hire, to get it admitted as a lawyer. And anyway, I don't know if you think that sort of comes through in the narrative at all.
Yeah. So that was a conscious decision not to really highlight that. and bring it forward. And I did that for a couple of reasons. Well, first, I felt like if I did that, it was going to just like destroy the narrative, right? Because like it's such a complicated thing. I was going to have to like talk to a bunch of people, really get the story right, like, and I felt like for the narrative that I was trying to put forward, that might complicate things a little bit and slow it down. And I think that the second reason, and this is probably the primary reason, is I try in the book as much as possible to give a good faith interpretation to what people are saying. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is to, just kind of give them as much rope as they can possibly have. And then the other one is that I just feel like if you don't, I didn't want to write like a polemic, basically. So I felt that, digging deep into Hale, like right off of the bat would I just didn't feel like super comfortable that I knew everything about that. And that, I mean, it was the same thing. Like there are other parts of his past as well. Different investments and stuff that he made, before he started writing, that people have addressed me and have said, hey, like, why didn't you like bring this up and stuff? It's just because I had to make certain decisions, I think. And I was just kind of like, I don't feel like super comfortable that I know everything about this. But I think that Greenwald has said repeatedly that what he wanted to do was this kind of pro bono defending of people in the same way that like, Noam Chomsky saying that, somebody should have the right to like deny the Holocaust, even if it's, an obscene and horrible view, like you should still have the right to do it. And I just kind of like, I think of Glenn, he's Gen X, right? He's like, he and Taibbi have always said, and I do believe them on this, that they really do believe in the idea of like the ACLU, like defend everybody. Like if you defend the most disgusting speech in order to protect like all speech, like this kind of stuff. So I felt that I would just kind of like, it's something that's a part of his biography that you can't like skip over, but I didn't feel like it was something that really needed to be dug into.
It might fit in.
That was the judgment call that I made.
No, I think it's interesting because it might fit into the kind of more original view of Glenn Greenwald, which is like, or both of them, as you say, free speech, First Amendment absolutists, and sometimes that means you defend Nazis and their right to speak and all that. But what's interesting in the narrative, though, and maybe I think you're right to not focus on that, is that like MAGA and Glenn and Matt and these guys are now taking on the idea that they are the speakers of truth and they're the free speech promoters as against the woke censors and the DEI authoritarian liberals or something like that. And I think that merging of what was maybe more like civil rights libertarian, say what you will about it, it's a kind of coherent ideological approach, has become something different and a kind of perversion of what is censorship and what isn't, and who actually is being censored and who has power. And like, moving from an anti-war, anti-government, anti-NSA civil libertarianism to like aligning with powerful oligarchs who are actually co-opting the government and literally getting government contracts to use their technologies to deploy in war and all that. So like that is a super interesting shift. Maybe you could talk about that, right? Yeah,
absolutely. So there are a couple of things here. I think primarily Glenn and Matt pretending that despite the fact that Trump is the president and that the Republicans control all three branches of government, that liberals in social media companies or in the State Department are somehow controlling the government and controlling who can speak. Because that's basically like what they have to say now.
Didn't you have a line about Teen Vogue is the real danger? Wasn't there a line about like Teen Vogue?
Yeah, that's Adam said. Like, yeah, like I'd have to find it. He said something to the effect of like, you're saying fucking Teen Vogue is like, the biggest threat to free speech while all this stuff is going on. Yeah, so I think that they are kind of in a rock and a hard place here because they want to continue to appeal to that audience that they are appealing to, but at the same time they're kind of stuck. They're stuck in this situation where, it's like the dog that caught the car, right? Like I have an article coming out about this, like how they're kind of all handling this. But they got everything that they want. They won't be particularly combative toward the people who are in power because their audience loves them. So they're just kind of like stuck in this weird limbo. But I do think that even even for the last 5-6 years, have certainly seen a shift in like who gets criticized, right? Like Glenn has taken on Palantir in recent years. In the last like calendar year, I believe.
And can you tell everyone what Palantir does? Like,
Palantir is Peter Thiel. A Peter Thiel founded company. It's a data processing company that does all kinds of just like evil stuff, basically, for the U.S. empire. I mean, there's really no other way to say it. That's how they define their mission. They kill people for the West, basically. They are a powerful company, and they are about to get like hugely powerful now because their AI and like they have contracts with the government, like their projection. I was listening to their earnings projections are just insane. Speaking of insane, like what CEO Matt Karp said, like he's just talking about how like we're proud to be part of the West and like do all of this killing for you. It's just like, I mean, like it's that's the kind of company it is, right? So, and Glenn has criticized them, right, in the last like year and a half. But what does he criticize them for, right? Has he criticized them for their surveillance? Has he criticized them for their large government contracts? Has he criticized them for their involvement with the surveillance architecture? No, he has not. He only criticized them in the wake of October 7th, when they said that they would offer a path to hiring Jewish students who felt uncomfortable on college campuses, which, by the way, is totally risible and should be like made fun of and joked about. But that's like the only thing I could find that he was critical of them about. Same with any of these companies that these tech guys like, Elon Musk's like huge government contracts. Why aren't they talking about that? This is a huge part of this story, of what's happening as we're recording right now. Like the reason that these guys are all so rich is because they have huge government contracts. They have massive influence over how the government, puts out these contracts and makes laws, not to mention like Musk having, essentially like satellites like you wouldn't believe up in the sky. I mean, like this is a national security issue and situation here. And it's all like one person controlling it, not to mention like all these different companies controlling it, right? So all this stuff, it sounds like hyperbole. I'm literally just describing like the situation.
Did you see that he's now making a bid for OpenAI? Did you catch that today?
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, I mean, I saw that. I mean, that's just like that's just crazy. I don't think that it doesn't look like that's going to happen. But if you went back 10 or 15 years ago and you showed this to the Glenn Greenwald and the Matt Taibbi then, when they were like allied with left or aligned with liberalism at least, they would be objecting to this. They would be pointing this stuff out. Matt would be writing an article where he describes Elon Musk in unflattering terms. Glenn would be writing an article for Salon with like 7 updates about all the things that like Musk is doing in like the, in the Doge or whatever. But instead they're just like ignoring this stuff for the most part and just kind of taking a complete culture war approach to all of these issues, while there are serious, profound threats to the civil liberties and the entire government structure that these guys have like built their careers on criticizing and addressing. And it's just depressing, honestly.
It does make a wild contrast to, complain about all this censorship and stuff from woke, whoever, the notorious woke conspiracy and DEI. And now, under Trump and Musk, like the government is just purging anything having to do with women or minorities from everywhere and basically just rolling back the entire civil rights movement. They're basically attempting to resegregate the military, stop recruitment in black universities and so on, stop black outreach programs. And, of course, the military is heavily minority, except for the Marines. It's more diverse than the population as a whole, in part because a lot of soldiers come from underprivileged backgrounds because it's one way to, actually have some upward mobility. It's just like they're still, pretending that like Obama's president and he's doing the surveillance, and it's just wild. I guess maybe the last thing that the last thing I wanted to bring up was the Me Too angle with Taibbi and how that played into his turn.
Yeah. So that goes back to what we were talking about, right, in the beginning. Right. So Taibbi is objecting to the Democrat and liberal Russiagate obsession. And he is writing a lot of critical articles about this. And I think a lot of them were good, like really, really like dissecting this and pointing out how like myopic it was and what a dead end it was. Right. And as he's doing this, he's losing liberal audience. And he writes this book about Eric Garner. It's like a Black Lives Matter book. I have always interpreted this as kind of an attempt to reset with his liberal audience, an attempt to kind of get back to the way things used to be. And it comes out, and Me Too has kind of exploded a couple months before. And Mike Cernovich and this guy, Jim Goad, start hammering him with his past writings, specifically from the Exile book, but also just like other things that he wrote. And he basically gets like mini canceled. I wouldn't say he got like totally canceled, but like he got enough shit about it that he had to cancel a lot of tour dates for the book. He had to, the book didn't sell very well. I don't know, but I don't think it sold very well. And a lot of liberal people who didn't like him already jumped on this and really held him to the fire, I think, in a way that they might not have a few years before, quite honestly. Who knows? But I think that it's reasonable to say that they wouldn't have been quite as harsh on him. I think that kind of like turned him against liberalism and the left. I also should add that like this wasn't just like his old writings like about abusing women in Russia, which could be kind of like, and were kind of brushed aside as satire. And, look, Walker Bragman for Pace Magazine like looked into this. And, people who worked with Taibbi at the time said that like it was satire, like he didn't treat any of us like this. Like, so like, who knows? Like, I'm not saying that like I have like any like strong opinion on this. I'm just saying that it does seem that it was at least in part satire, right? But they were writing really horrible things, but they were making fun of or satirizing the Americans who were in Russia at the time, kind of taking advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But with that huge windup here, this woman, I think her name was Kathy Lally. She wrote in the Washington Post about how he had written about her, really like abusive stuff, specific to her. And this kind of targeted harassment, I think, is what moved it from being just like this satire, this book of satire, these satirical articles in this magazine, to being kind of like a more targeted harassment campaign. And I think that's kind of like what made it so that he wasn't able to kind of just wriggle out of it, because the stuff that he wrote was really, again, it wasn't like hyper abusive in like he wasn't like fantasizing about assaulting her or attacking her, but the way that he was insulting her was so like misogynistic and just like really abusive and gross that I think that that's why it was like very difficult for him to kind of wriggle out of it. And so I think that is like really like irrespective of whether or not like it was satire, like whatever, those attacks and that harassment, especially when she like wrote about it in the Washington Post, again, like that's like a big paper. I think that's what really kind of drove that final nail in. And I really kind of trace his shift right to that moment, even though it was these guys on the right who were the ones who used this to attack him. Like, even though like that was the situation, he still decided that like the right was a better home for him. And I think that was, I mean, that's obviously the decision that he made, but I think that was not the right one.
You got to go, Owen. So thanks for coming on the show. The book is called Owned: How the Tech Billionaires on the Right Bought the Loudest Voices on the Left. Good read. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, great work, man.
As well as those the videos I made about sort of setting the stage. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.